Hi everyone, and welcome to our Cyber Risk Masterclass entitled Big, Obvious and Coming Straight at You. My name is Tiffaine and I am the CEO of FERMA. Of course, cyber risk is not new and is everywhere. It's a reality that all organizations must accept and integrate because it has become a real marker of our time. As you know, there's been a really deep acceleration of digitalization over the past months as a result of the pandemic. Some organizations had already begun the digitalization journey before the pandemic, but for many of them, the COVID-19 has turned digitalization from a nice to have to a must have in order to keep their operations running. And there's no turning back. So while the use of new technologies offers many opportunities, it is also the meaning of threats. In fact, digitalization means a bigger attack surface, an increased cyber risk, making cybersecurity a strategic priority. So it would be presumptuous of us to think that we will cover all aspects of cyber risk in the next hour and a half. But with our speakers, we will touch upon different elements of cyber risk. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our four highly knowledgeable speakers on this topic. I will start with Erka. Erka Koivunen is the Chief Information Security Officer of the leading cybersecurity company F-Secure. In his day-to-day role, Erka is responsible for info security, software security and privacy. He also represents F-Secure, his company, and the wider cybersecurity industry in the discussions with the European institutions. Speaking about the EU institutions, we are pleased also to have today with us Jakub Boratynski from the European Commission. He is working in the Directorate General Communication Networks, Content and Technology. Jakub is the Deputy Director of the Directorate dealing with digital society, trust and cybersecurity. He is also the head of unit in charge of cybersecurity and digital privacy policy. He's been involved in different important files, notably the Cybersecurity Act, the revision of the Network and Information Security Directive, the NIS Directive, and also the upcoming new EU cybersecurity strategy, just to name a few. We also have with us Arne Damvin, who is the Executive Vice President of DNB Technology and Services Core Banking. DNB is Norway's largest financial services group and one of the largest in the Nordic region. Arne has more than 35 years experience in deep IT technology and more than 20 years experience in IT within the financial sector. And last but not least, Sir Rob Wainwright, who is a senior partner at Deloitte. Rob is advising the boards and the executive teams of global companies on financial crime and cyber, other areas of risk and cyber transformation models. Rob previously served as the executive director of Europol, the European Union law enforcement agency, for almost a decade. Here, he helped establish the European Counter-Terrorism Center and the European Cybercrime Center. He also led the transformation of Europol into a global intelligence-led security institution. So as you can see, we have an impressive lineup of speakers. So do not hesitate to ask questions to them using the chat box. We will have the possibility to take your question after each presentation, and there will also be a Q&A at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm now passing on the floor to Kirsten Roha and Lassie Veisanen, who have put together this great masterclass and will moderate the session. Kirsten is the head of group insurance at DNB Bank and a member of NORIMA, the Norwegian Risk Management Association. And Lassie is the executive director of the Finnish Risk Management Association. I will personally be back at the end of the masterclass for the closing remarks. So Kirsten, Lassie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tiffin, and a warm welcome to all of you. Cyber risk, as Tiffin mentioned, continue to be a top concern for all of us. And even though we invest a lot to reduce the risk, COVID-19 pandemic have shown us how vulnerable of a society, businesses, and individuals are. Nearly 1% of the global GDP is lost to cybercrime every year, and cyber risk have become one of the fastest growing threats to businesses in a rapidly changing environment. Today, our main focus would be how to improve risk management, how changes in law and regulation will change current way to operate, increase focus on business continuity plans and how to handle consequences. And last, how to improve communication between various stakeholders to ensure that cyber risk is well integrated with business risk. Erka, you are the Chief Information Security Officer in F-Secure, as Tiffany mentioned, and you are the first to present for us today. What I would like to ask you is cyber risk a gray rhino? And could you see any trends during pandemic causing change of risk?
Thank you, Kirsten. The gray rhino as a metaphor is referring to something that everybody can see, but nobody is quite sure whether it's going to attack us, bite us, or just leave us as alone. And we are then ill-prepared or even unwilling to take any measures to address that particular type of risk. Our companies operating on a cybersecurity field, we try to assess cybersecurity risks and advise our customers while we're trying to protect our own infrastructure as well. And we do share the same worry that are all these cybersecurity risks, dependencies, and other aspects all taken care of and well addressed. The source of the problem comes from the fact that our world has digitalized. Everything is now networked. Everything runs on computers on network, and everything, in fact, runs on software. That opens up lots of new possibilities for making saves and creating stuff that was never ever possible in the past, but it also opens up lots of new vulnerabilities and opportunities for attackers. The world that we were promised that would have been easy to set up, easy to use, and cost efficient has turned into a source of grievance and endless possibilities for corporate executives to lose their job and investors to lose their money. So the reason that we are failing so miserably to secure our cybersecurity environment oftentimes can be narrowed down and kind of pinpointed to extremely small implementation errors or in not that evident mistakes in our thinking. In this picture, we can see a schematic of a modern airplane where, of course, the cockpit and the cabin systems need to be separated because that is just common sense. A passenger in the cabin should not be able to control the airplane and its avionics. And as a network engineer, I keep finding myself amazed to find that in the airplane, there's a shared network, and those two different networks talk to each other by way of passing the information between what's called a firewall. You connect a firewall to two networks when you want them to communicate, not when you don't want to have absolutely nothing shared between them. So that's why there are recorded cases where a passenger has been able to connect to a network on the cabin side, assume control of the so-called infotainment system, and see systems on the avionics side, which are supposed to be behind the firewall. And these are extremely trivial security issues, extremely cheap and commonplace components, which we all take for granted. And when a hacker sees those, they invariably find vulnerabilities and configuration weaknesses that help the adversaries to gain access. So when we are dealing about cybersecurity risks, we of course we need to try to understand what's our risk register, what type of individual risks with impacts and probabilities we do have, and our attempt is to move these from extreme exposure, severe impact, to either less probability or with a lesser impact. And in a well-maintained company, you will see that the so-called extreme risks will be pushed down to of lesser exposure. But that doesn't mean that the rhino would have actually walked away. There might be some small detail that you just simply have neglected, and while you have been busy having a conversation with your risk register, the vulnerability actually has been maturing, and the adversaries might be in a position to take advantage of that. So while, of course, this type of risk registry development shows that you have done a great job, it doesn't mean that your work has been finished. Typically, organizations have hard time understanding why would they, in particular, be targeted by malicious threat actors. And most of the time, yeah, you are not that interesting and you will not be targeted. But you might actually be a part of a value chain, or sometimes an opportunistic attacker just is there out to get somebody else and they instead target you. And I will show you two stories where this happened. The first story is about Finnish psychotherapy provider called Vastaamo. They had an innovative approach. They had internally built software for handling patient records, and they were able to expand by hiring new therapists, and they were able to onboard new patients in an efficient manner. The system that they had built was assuming that it was operating in a trusted, friendly environment. So in that sense, it was exhibiting all these characteristics of an old-fashioned on-premise system. For reasons that are still a bit unknown, but I'm willing to take a guess that the sysadmins chose to expose this patient's record system to the internet due to the fact that it was constantly broken and they needed to fix it oftentimes. And they needed to fix it during the night time, during the weekends, for long periods of time, and they just grew tired of having to go back to the office. So they drilled a hole in their corporate firewall for them to gain easy access to that system. Unfortunately, they exposed the database server, the MySQL server, to 7.5 billion people on this planet, which of course enables lots of opportunities for malicious activity. And that's exactly what happens when you expose something. There's a tool called Shodan that every hacker knows of, which indexes everything that is connected to the internet, and it indexes those in a fashion that would enable you as an attacker to launch attacks. If I perform a query for MySQL servers that are exposed to the internet, I easily find 1.5 million instances of those. Any one of those could be harboring vulnerabilities that would enable me to then breach their perimeter controls and suck all the data out from those servers. So let's assume that I'm a 16-year-old hacker wannabe with no programming skills, with no hacking skills to mention, but I just happen to find out of a ready-made script that appears to be exploiting configuration weaknesses in MySQL servers. Let me take the first server on this list. It turns out to be in California, United States, and by the list of ports open to the internet, I can immediately see that this is a server with lots of problems. This server has no place to be in the internet, and the choice and combination of those services exhibited by this server spells out that this is there by accident or through neglect. Anyhow, this should be an easy target for an adversary. I, however, am the 16-year-old with no skills, equipped with the script that attacks MySQL servers if I just find any. And let me see if that MySQL server is there indeed. I'm browsing through all the material that I don't have suitable attack tools, but of course the MySQL is there. And that's what happened with Vastaamo. Somebody 3 years ago made an attempt at running an attack script. They were successful, probably largely to their own amazement. They downloaded the contents of that MySQL server, and then they forgot about it for 2 years. After the 2-year period, they finally had the time to take a look at what is it that they actually had stolen from that server. And then they found out the way to monetize it. They first tried to extort money from the company CEO, and rightfully the CEO refused to pay, after which the attackers chose to start releasing patient records. And be reminded, this was a psychotherapy service provider, so there are some painful records that the patients absolutely don't want to be released. So they started releasing 100 patient records per day in an effort to extort money from the company. In the end, the company chose not to pay, so they started extorting money from the patients themselves, which made it the biggest criminal case in the Finnish history, with almost 30,000 plaintiffs. As a result of this bad publicity and all the liabilities, the company soon went bust. The ransom operator only got some 3,000 euros, and the person is nowadays a fugitive, and the law enforcement is closing in. So that was not such a highly planned operation. That was not a sophisticated cyber attack, and yet it was enough to make the company go bust. Another case where the target gets attacked and targeted by mistake. The Danish logistics giant Maersk basically was wiped off the internet, and all their internal systems were being not only brought down but even wiped. Not due to anybody attacking Maersk as such, but that was the origin of this incident was a Russian military action against Ukraine, and they wanted to also combine that with cyber weapons. Nowadays we call that cyber weapon NotPetya, which is a reference to its ransomware lookalike, but in reality it was just a piece of software designed to sabotage and destroy. In Ukraine, every company with a taxable presence needs to have an electronic tax filing application installed. So the tax filings need to be submitted in an electronic format. And the law requires that you need to choose one of the two candidates, and Russian intelligence chose to infiltrate another one of those providers. And each and every company that had business in Ukraine had this piece of software installed in their finance department. And in the next auto update, there was a piece of malware which first attacked domain controllers, and after that it wiped the whole corporate networks. Maersk was basically offline, unable to operate for weeks on end. And of course, Maersk, while they knew that they were affected by geopolitics and they knew that they would be subject to ransomware, they never were in a position to dream of a situation where such big damage could be inflicted by accident. So my advice to everybody is to, on the side, while you are checking your risk register, and when you feel confident enough that it is progressing, also test your assumptions, test your systems, and find those hard to find vulnerabilities and configuration weaknesses, which otherwise, if unaddressed, would be your gray rhino. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erka. We have got a couple of questions for you. One of them is, what can risk manager do to better anticipate cyber risk, and how could they stay up to date with what's happening?
Basically, my kind of a practice-proven rule is that you need to ask the risk owners or those who are contributing to the treatment plans a couple of clarifying questions that oftentimes they start with why. You want to challenge everybody who has an incentive to kind of move the risk exposure or the impact or probability to a lower place, because that would get the risk managers off their back. You need to really challenge them to see if they are honest with their assessment and if they truly believe that there are no hidden corners or kind of conveniently left out assumptions in the documentation or in the treatment plan. The threat modeling approach has been extremely useful because that enables the owners of those systems or tools or processes to describe where the data goes, where's the user experience happening, and what assumptions do we have on kind of interconnected systems and their security.
I also have another nice question here from the audience. How can you be sure who is behind the cyber attack? Are we really sure that the organ of the attack on Maersk?
With the case of Maersk, yeah, that is quite well proven in most cases, and particularly when you are a target of a cyber attack. Yeah, I agree that it is extremely difficult to assess the origin and those who are even helping and contributing to the attack. And in most cases, that should not be your first priority to even determine who is behind the attack. Yeah, while the incident is being unfolding, you need to try to understand the impact and ways to mitigate that. In some extremely mature organizations, the insights over what the adversary could be like could help you to understand their further motivations and their tooling and capabilities. But in most pragmatic settings, the attribution to specific threat actors should be done afterwards.
Thank you so much, Erka. This was really interesting. Moving over to more regulatory side of the topic of cyber risk, we now have Jakub Boratynski from the European Commission to speak about cybersecurity policy and regulation from EU level. Jakub, what could you tell us about what is happening in terms of policy of cybersecurity and where it is going?
So good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you in the FERMA event. I just realized also, given time constraints, I would better not go through the slides. You know, I would like to really pick up on few essential points. I mean, what Erka was describing to you are some of, let's say, the real life challenges, the real life, I would even say, disasters that happen. And I think we just, you know, from a policy point of view, you just reflect how you can actually help in a way that would basically ultimately support cybersecurity guys, you know, at this sort of grassroots level to do the right thing. So, because I mean, ultimately, it's a shared responsibility, and no matter what type of regulation would be put in place, I mean, ultimately, it is actually the measures on the ground, protection of the companies, of public administration entities that can make the difference. Now, from a European policy perspective, you had one major measure that accompanied first strategy, that was the NIS directive, which is now currently undergoing revision. This is basically the first tool that allows to us achieve a certain baseline level of capabilities. This is about member states' capabilities, but it is also about obligations for the companies to undertake cybersecurity measures and report serious incidents. Ultimately, it is basically a tool that puts cybersecurity on par with other elements of legal compliance and can effectively translate into, let's say, boardroom decisions about right level of investment in cybersecurity. So it's not just an add-on, something for IT guys to worry about. No, this increasingly should become let's say, a central consideration for the boardroom, and having this in the legislation helps. Now, in the recently adopted strategy at the end of last year, we have come up with the NIS2, which basically brings about new range of measures and extends the scope to a much larger part of the economy and society. So that's one important element that I would like to draw your attention to. There have been a lot of focus on actually putting the risk management obligations on the companies, but it is really essential that we address the question of security of products, IT solutions, and software themselves. I mean, for a good reason, until quite recently, we can talk about that this has been very much outside of the regulation. I mean, it was seen, you know, as a in a way price to be paid for innovation, that the regulatory intervention has been very limited. But I think with that degree of dependence that we are today, we're so much dependent on digital solutions, with the pandemics moving us even faster to let's say, digital dimension of our work, our life, stakes are enormous. So it is really essential that we make sure that in connected products, in ICT products, there are some basic security issues addressed, that security by design becomes really a widely applied practice. And this is the reason why Commission has announced in the strategy that we would be basically reflecting about possible cybersecurity requirements for products. And now Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in her announcement of the State of the Union speech, she also actually very much went in this direction, announcing Cyber Resilience Act that would bring about, you know, let's say, common standards for cybersecurity products. And, you know, what it means in practice. I mean, in practice, it means, for example, you should not be able to sell in a supermarket, you know, a router that does not require any, you know, password protection, you know, that is easily, that is actually hackable, not even hack, it's just simply like open completely, you know. And So it is not necessarily about highly sophisticated measures, but also making sure that consumer products do conform to some basic cybersecurity standards. So, for example, we are able to avoid situations like with Mirai botnets, when you had basically thousands of connected cameras, easily hacked and becoming part of a huge botnet. So I was referring to the regulation. So one more perhaps element that is worth of mentioning is the Cybersecurity Act, which provides for cybersecurity certification framework. So that's another way where we actually can make sure that those who have to manage cybersecurity can increasingly rely on certified products that do not necessarily mean that, of course, that they guarantee 100% security. There is no 100% security, but at least, it gives a certain degree of assurance and it's a real help in managing cybersecurity. Policy is definitely not just about regulation. It is also about making sure that actually we have rights frameworks in place where cybersecurity professionals can work together, that we have a really robust framework for information sharing, for sharing threat intelligence, which, as of course we all know, is fundamental in increasing our cyber resilience. So there have been things done at a European level, such as creation of the network of national CSIRTs, computer security response teams. But we are very much going on that track also by supporting voluntary information sharing schemes such as ISACs. We have a major investment resources for investment available under new EU budget, where in the Digital Euro program we are planning to basically invest in total over 4 billion euros over next 7 years. And that also means that we actually are looking for presence of cybersecurity also in the national recovery programs, which are part of, let's say, post-pandemic effort. And we see quite a lot of good ideas in that respect. So again, in a wider sense, I think it's a lot about, bringing together capacities, the resources that we have at European, at national level, together with the private sector. And I would maybe, just to give space for question, let me just highlight one last element of that, which is basically which is the question of how are we collectively prepared as Europe to a major cyber attack. When I'm referring to a major cyber attack, we probably have in mind something like attack on Colonial Pipeline in the US, on the eastern coast of US, because that is one of these prime examples when we see that basically a cyber attack leads to very tangible physical impact. In that case, halting of deliveries of oil to millions of consumers on the east coast of the US. So that basically showed to us what's possible, and it's absolutely essential that we are actually getting up together to know how we can actually mutually support each other in case of crisis. So Commission a recommendation for establishment of a joint cyber unit, which was adopted by the European Commission in June of this year, is basically a step towards indeed completing cyber crisis management framework, and also, very importantly, creating mechanisms for different cybersecurity communities working together. So what we do refer as let's say, civilian NIS community, the people who work on cybersecurity in national CERTs, in the companies. But it's important that there is a way to work in an effective way with law enforcement. Anyway, we have Rob Wainwright on the call. Under his watch, it was major stepping up of Europol capacity to work on cybercrime in the form of creation of European Cybercrime Center. So we need to work with those people, and also with the diplomatic community. Some of the incidents that have been brought forward, do include the role of foreign foreign actors, and it's essential that we collectively have a possibility to respond via different diplomatic means, including also a possibility to impose sanctions. So with that kind of overview of different elements of, let's say, what we could see as a toolbox of different measures from regulatory to more soft ones, this is what can ultimately help us to manage cybersecurity risks in a responsible manner and mitigate the threat. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Jakub. This was very useful and informative. I have a very interesting question coming up here. Do you see room for a public-private partnership solution on cyber resilience from an insurance perspective, driven by EU Commission going forward?
Yeah, I mean, from an insurance perspective, I recall my conversations with the insurance sectors for a number of years when we have been indeed, like exchanging views that, now it's really finally the time for insurance to play a more prominent role in management of cybersecurity risks. What we have been seeing, of course, that let's say a structure, but I mean, you are much better expert than me, but one of the key obstacles in that respect was a difficulty of pricing the cybersecurity risks, the difficulty to evaluate the cost of the damage. And obviously what we try to do is that with all the measures supporting mandatory notification of incidents, with the measures supporting voluntary exchange of information, we hope that this, let's say, evidence about actually the real impacts of the incidents will grow, will be expanded, and that would actually give more indeed elements to develop more, let's say, I don't know, sound insurance products and create a bigger market for this. So this is, I think, the type of an interplay, and we let's say at a more strategic level between what we do on the policy side and how it can benefit cyber insurance and vice versa. I think that we have some specific public-private schemes when it comes to ISACs, voluntary information sharing schemes, and I would imagine that while this is basically the sector we have the most developed, probably most developed network of sharing information in the financial sector, but we have also ISACs being established for other sectors. I would think that there is definitely a role for insurance industry to push for that and to be there around the table.
Fully agree. Thank you again once more, Jakub. This was really informative. And now, Lasse, over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to the previous speakers as well. So we are now running ahead, and the next one is who's to give the presentation is Arne Damvin. Arne, resigning from banking point of view, focused very much on digitalization with opportunities and challenges due to pandemic. So I know that you will give us some practical examples from your bank, how to secure business continuity from the IT and the entire business point of view, and also how to deal with the possible consequences if you are not succeeding as planned. Please, Arne.
Digital event. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Lasse, and it's a pleasure to be here at the FERMA digital event. Yes, I'm going to go through a practical example on how to handle resilience in a pandemic event. So if the slides are catching up, yes, one more, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. So basically, I thought it might be a good idea to give a short background on the Norwegian society and DNB in specifics. Worth mentioning is that the Norwegian society is a highly digitized society already. So if you have interactions with financial sector, or if you interact with the public sector, you're actually using digital tools. So it's quite sensitive to large events like pandemic outbreaks, etc. But also worth mentioning is that Norway is the world's most cashless society, where 98.4% of the payments are actually digital. You pay for bus fare, train fares, in the stores, in taxis, etc. You pay with digital means, usually by app, but also by card. This means that the society is highly dependent on technology and people managing the technology, and that goes for DNB as well. And as many European banks, DNB has outsourced part of its IT portfolio in a global IT supply chain. And worth mentioning, last but not least, DNB is a very system-critical bank in Norway because we do a lot of clearing and payments for other banks, and also the volume of transactions going through DNB is approximately over 50% of what's going on in Norway. So how do you manage that then during an pandemic outbreak? So if you take us to the next slide. And I'll try to tell the story on how we focus, because the first days and weeks we were very focused on ensuring society and business critical functions to work. So even if there was a big change coming up for people, this was before people was working from home, but still we saw more and more lockdown, etc. So our main focus was to ensure that the fabric of the society, e.g. payments for the service that you procure, was working, and also for DNB was ensuring that that our promise to the society on the service we deliver was actually fulfilled. But we also had another task, and that was getting 10,000 plus employees to work from home, which rendered both infrastructure connectivity issues, but also equipment, because a lot of the people were working on desktop computers, not laptops, etc. So it's not just take it back home and start working there. So basically, when the first bits of the pandemic started up, we had a capacity of 20%, being able to support 20% of the workforce working from home. So what do you do then? Well, we did an asset inventory and thought about, are we able to repurpose some of the assets that we built to handle other type of crisis? And DNB has multiple data centers where we host all our main systems. But in every production data center, you also have a disaster recovery data center, which is geographically separated. So we thought about, how can we use the equipment we have there also to support incidents like this? Because they're primarily built for major outages where all the data center disappears, so to speak, in a fire or explosion or cyber event or whatever. So what we did was we built an asset list and looked into how we could repurpose what we had there to also support our work from home initiative. So in day 3 and 4, we were actually able to double the capacity, up to 40% of our workforce working from home. But that was not enough. Our aim was to get to 100% of the employees very fast. So and the big challenge with that is that it usually requires infrastructure to be built into data centers or equipment to be bought. So we looked into our other assets that we have in the company, like where can we find connectivity and where can we utilize that. And we have a fairly large cloud offering where connectivity was in place as well. So we built virtual appliances in the cloud to also support the work from home. So after 8 or 9 days, we were actually able to support 100% work from home for all employees in DNB. Next step we also looked at was identifying risk and preparing for events in a globalized IT value chains, because we understood that what's happening in China and starting happening in Europe might happening in a global scale. So we looked at, okay, what type of personnel and location might become unavailable and what will that mean to our service offering. So in close interaction with the upper management, we visualized risk and gave them options to be able to support running DNB even if our globalized supply chain was affected. So basically, we looked into our operations arm, which is in the Baltics, what we can support and do there with a clear risk, etc. and we took precautions and adjusted for each location. What is acceptable risk in one location might be a high risk in another. So we implement a lot of mitigating tasks like check-ins, manual check-ins, closing down of systems after work days, and if there was rotas, we only allowing people that was in the rota to access systems, etc., and automatically lock them out. And this was in May, and by June we saw that there was a bigger lockdown going globally. So then we decided to shift the IT operations from the global model to a local Norwegian model. I'll come back and tell a little bit more about that, but we did that within 24 hours without service disruption to any service, and with full production within DNB as well. So we did it actually a couple of times. And the last part that we did in the early phase was to adjust ourselves that this probably will be a long-lasting event. So we thought of it and thought that if we're really unlucky, it will last 1.5 to 2 years. So better make the exceptional normal as fast as possible and get people to work as usual. So if you go to the next slide, I'll go to a couple of pointers on what was it that enabled us to do this. And if I look at the key points for an initial setup of a continuity plan, this was way before the COVID-19 event. Disaster recovery plans for IT infrastructure. We spent a lot of time thinking and building disaster recovery environments from the IT infrastructure data sensors that we have. And one of the key points there was that we wanted to be able to utilize the resources that we have in the disaster recovery also for other type of events, not just the big ones like fire and natural catastrophes, etc., but that we can reuse them for other events as well. We spent a lot of time on thinking about business continuity for IT personnel and locations. So basically, we set up we set it up like we should have capacity and knowledge in each of the locations to ensure that you have the minimal setup to do operations on it. Ability to cover basic operations from each location. That doesn't mean that we have a duplicate or triplicate of people, but we ensure that people, for example, working on application development, have the ability also to do application operations in crisis situations. So it's easy for us to say that we repurpose the people to also do other tasks when it's necessary. Culture. We also spent a lot of time building a culture for handling consequences, not specific events or scenarios, because if you try to map out all the scenarios, we didn't have a scenario thinking around the pandemic that hit us, but we had if you decompose each of the events and scenarios, you will find that the consequences are quite the same. And we have a well-defined crisis management organization with clear roles and responsibilities. And one of the key aspects there is that we build that on top of the incident management organization, which are handling incident day by day, because then they're well trained in handling incident and have a holistic approach to what company and society needs. So if you move to the next slide, during the crisis, one of the key things that we did was to identify asset and repurpose it if necessary to adopt to new situations. Think of what you have and think of where you're trying to go instead of thinking, oh, what scenario card should I look at? But look at what the capabilities that you have available. Identify what's hard to fix in a short time frame and look for alternatives, like if you need the connectivity, more network capacity, then you either need to ask your telco to dig a new ditch or install equipment, or maybe you can utilize a cloud connectivity to do that. Important part, strengthen security and monitoring. That was where we spent a lot of time also during the event to see how we can strengthen security and monitoring to look for anomalies in the new setup. And there was quite much invested on that. And next point, don't be afraid to execute on continuity plans. Of course, you need to build confidence into them, but confidence is built by training. So if you don't train on your continuity plans, business continuity plans for people, etc., start with it now, so you have the confidence in them to execute when it happens. Establish close interaction with upper management and make the exceptional event into a new normal. To round it off, I created a short checklist that might come handy for some of you if you want to look at it in your own company as well. So if you go to the next slide. It's a short 6-point checklist. It could be much larger, but here we go. Repurposal disaster recovery solution for IT infrastructure. Make sure that you discuss that with your IT units if you're a risk specialist. Business continuity plan for personnel and location outages. Plan for handling consequences, not events or scenarios only. Dedicated crisis management organization with clear roles and make use of the people that work with crisis management day to day. Risk as a natural part of IT and business. We've done a lot of that in DNB. 5 years ago, we're not mature at that at all, but now much of the IT decisions we take are risk-based to mitigate any risk that we identify. And last but not least, training is vital. Make sure that you train at least 2 to 4 times a year on handling different type of crisis. So that was a short practical walkthrough.
Thank you, Arne. This was a very good exercise what you have been doing. So I've been receiving some questions to you, so I hope that you can also give me and the audience some answers. So
Yep.
The first one is, what lessons have you learned that you think can be applied outside of banking in terms of cyber resilience?
I think that the best part of the lessons that we learned is that if you try to plan for all type of scenarios, it's really hard to hit the target. So decompose the scenarios and look at the consequences and things that might happen to you, and plan for handling them as well, because the number of different components are much smaller than the different scenarios, and that goes for all type of businesses. Yes.
Thank you. The next one is, how important to cyber resilience is data? Has PSD2 affected your approach to cyber resilience in any way?
Yes, it has. Data is vital to cyber resilience. If you cannot trust your data, you cannot trust anything. So, but also in regards of PSD2, my reflection is that the PSD2 opened up a new channel into your the core of your core systems. So it's many things that needs to be taken into account. One is data quality and security. That's one thing, but it also represents a potential issue when it comes to performance. When you have unknown performance, unknown usage of your systems via PSD2 interface, it might affect the other part of your operations as well. So you need to protect your core systems, and you need to protect them when it comes to performance and throttling, so you're ensure that you're able to fulfill the obligations you have towards customers and society.
Thank you, Arne.
Thank you.
So we go ahead. So Rob Wainwright. So Sir Rob, since you will be speaking about this digital transformation, how it makes cyber risk more relevant at board level of organization, I hope that you will give us some tips on how to deal with risk management on cyber risk questions and why they should make it a priority. Rob, you are most welcome.
Thank you, Lassie, and thank you to FERMA for inviting me today. A warm welcome to everyone tuning in. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about cyber at the boardroom level. That's already been mentioned today. I think Jakub had mentioned his view that cyber belongs now much more on the boardroom agenda, not just at the level of technology and IT, and I absolutely agree. And the good news is that as I work currently with the boards and executive teams of many global companies, that I am seeing that shift towards cyber becoming much more a board level, a board owned subject. I read a McKinsey report recently that said, for example, in the financial sector, 65% of all financial institutions now have at least one board director with expertise in cybersecurity, and that's quite a change. That almost 50% of all companies these days are having regular cyber simulation exercises at the board level, something that sometimes I'm involved in running and would thoroughly recommend as well. But if that's the good news, I think there are still some challenges out there. What I see when I engage with boards and what I read more and more about is that there is that heightened level of interest in the subject, a willingness to take part in the issues around cyber, but generally boards still don't understand the subject. And indeed, more than that, that they're frightened of it. Indeed, I think it is a weakness in our cybersecurity community generally that it is fear, not trust, that is the prevailing tone around cyber issues. There's still this hidden or dark mystique about what cyber means. And all of that tells you two important things, I think, about cyber today. One is that the subject, of course, is so much more in the news. Nearly every week we see a new news report of a significant ransomware attack, for example. And the fact, so that obviously explains why boards are more interested in the subject, perhaps. But it comes from a deep technological background, of course, so that those responsible traditionally for communicating cyber issues have had a deep technical knowledge, not always perhaps the best people to convert that very deep specific knowledge, technical knowledge, into a board level communication, which is a different kind of strategic exchange, as all of you will know, and I will maybe talk a little bit about that over the next couple of minutes. The shape of communication at the board level, and indeed the shape really and the narrative of the people that are delivering it really matter if we're to get boards properly bought into managing the consequences of cyber risk. Now, how cyber matters for the boards, why it does. It's important that we use the language right, use the content right, that we select that part of the cyber story that's unfolding in front of our eyes from week to week. Only that part that we know that would grab the attention of what is the highest level in business, and those around it. So let's take ransomware as an example of why it matters at the board level, and often I talk about it in these terms. Well, for one matter, financial losses are growing. A US insurance company paid out $40 million US earlier this year in a ransom payment. That's at the top end of what we're seeing across the industry, but the trend is pretty clear. But actually, even 40 million to global companies is quite a small amount of money, frankly, and that's not what's going to really worry a board of a large global company. They are much more concerned by the other trends connected with ransomware at the moment. The fact that organizations are experiencing more and more significant disruption to their operations. The nature of ransomware and the capability malware behind has got to a certain level now, in which the disruption is now significant, that they're having networks taken down across the board, that the actors, the smartest amongst them, are smart enough, for example, to infect and lock down the backup systems before deploying the ransom note across the system. So in a hidden way, before you even know it, your backup arrangements are also locked down, and they're smart enough to do that. So the disruption to your IT and indeed business operations is much more significant these days in the biggest attacks that we've seen at any time in the past. They're also finding it very challenging to fully recover disrupted or stolen data. And in many cases, they'll never get back all of the data that has been corrupted or stolen. And that's significant for all the reasons that Arne was just talking about the importance of having control over your data. Also, in a significant report that I read, which was on average is taking 23 days for companies to recover from a ransomware attack, even if they choose to pay out a ransom. So even if you pay, you're still taking over 3 weeks before you get back to any kind of level of operational functionality. And 23 days is a long time for a global company to have its IT business operations significantly disrupted in that matter. So for all those reasons, operational disruption is a big board level concern, and that's what ransomware means. Even more importantly, to a board at least, function of any board, a supervisory board especially, is to safeguard the long-term value creation, the long-term health of the company. And so what really matters through the eyes of a ransomware attack is the reputation. The reputation of the company over the long term is on the line. And that's what really matters. And why it matters, because, well, ransomware is much more in the news. You know, as we heard from Jakub and others, we've had important, significant attacks on the national infrastructure. Colonial Pipeline was one, health service in Ireland was another one in the recent months. So more is impacting public in a more direct way, as Jakub was describing. That's put it on the political level. Who'd have thought even a year ago that ransomware would have been an agenda topic at the G7 summit, as it was brought by the Biden administration. So here's the G7, the highest political level, or one of them in the world. They're talking about urgent problems like COVID, like climate change, these huge global problems, and ransomware is on the agenda. That tells you a lot about the level of interest and scrutiny at the highest political level. That translates itself into a certain kind of expectation and pressure on global companies to manage the effects of this well, to be prepared well, to certainly have high standards of cybersecurity resilience baked into your world. But when you have that bad day and have the attack, all eyes are on you in terms of kind of level of organizational competence you show in dealing with it, what levels of transparency you show to your stakeholders, your consumers, your own staff, public at large, and of course to the regulators. And it all crystallizes itself, of course, in the eyes of the board around that key pivot moment in any attack. Do you pay or do you not pay? Because hanging on that operational decision, that policy decision, that board level decision, is a lot of your reputation one way or the other. So for all these reasons, risk to reputation, massive IT disruption, and a much smaller, to a much smaller extent, financial losses, this is a board level concern. And I use ransomware as an example to share with you how the mindset, I think, of many boards are thinking about cyber at the moment. They focus on the big picture stuff, of course, not the technical detail, not the small stuff. Why should it matter to us? How is it going to affect us at that big strategic level, of course? So in communicating, very often having this discussion, much less detail actually, and much more insight. So you can refer to examples from cases like I have been today, but use them to tell a story, use them to connect to a wider strategy. It matters because of this. The actual detail of how many victims, how long the attack lasted, where it came from, is less interest, I think, to those at the top of the executive pyramid. So less detail, more insight. That's why SolarWinds, for example, which alongside the attack on Colonial Pipeline dominated the cyber scene at the end of last year. Very, very significant attack. The US government sector pretty much stunned by the level of attack capability behind that. They could penetrate the deepest reaches of the defense industry, lay hidden for such a long time. It generally surprised people as to just how advanced the top end capability is now. That matters. It should matter to any company if at the very highest level the threat out there is in that space. Now, it's important, therefore, that the full reality of how the cyber attack, cyber threat is evolving, that is shared at the board level, At the same time, you have to put it in perspective, and don't sell fear in the way that I mentioned at the start. It doesn't help. Fear gives rise to the wrong kind of human psychology response, of course. So you hunker down, you are less willing to take appropriate risks, and you're less likely to innovate. So it shouldn't be fear, it should be about building trust. And when you talk about the threats in these terms, I always try to do it within the wider perspective. Yes, it's a serious threat. Yes, it can cause significant disruption. Yes, in some ways it's getting more difficult. But in the end, it's just a risk. There isn't a mystique about it. It's not some monster or ghost hovering above us that we don't understand. We can understand it. Of course, we can invest more resources into understanding it more. But in the end, it's a risk to be managed. And most governments, all governments, all companies, have the means by which to run quite a sophisticated risk management process. Cyber, in many ways, despite its certain technical flavor, is no different. It's just another risk to manage. And when you think of it in that mindset, that you can't remove the threat, cyber's here to stay, but you can mitigate it down to a level that is acceptable, that you can prepare for the bad day when it happens by having crisis simulation exercises, for example, that you can build good level of cybersecurity, hygiene and resilience across your business, then you can accept in a confident way, actually, that I have the cyber threat under the control as far as I can, without it therefore having a disproportionate effect on my ability to carry on functioning as a viable business. I'm going to accept the risk in that way, and I'm going to get on with my life and deliver it. And when it happens in a bad way, I'm ready for it. And that's the right kind of mindset of resilience that I always encourage boards to have. And that concept of resilience, which has a full reality picture behind it of where the threat is heading, is probably the place that we need to get more and more of the industry getting to in the next few years. So to sum up, the cyber threat is changing. I was lucky enough through my experience at Europol, to observe the cyber threat actors, and indeed many other of the worst kind of organized crime and terrorist groups in the world. I was lucky enough to observe them a bit close up, to see how they're evolving, to see how they are penetrating and exploiting this age of technology and turning internet and other new technologies against us in quite an enterprising way. The dark market has powered them, mobilized them on a much more global scale than we've seen before. And they're developing tools that are more aggressive than we've seen before. At the same time, this significant trend of malicious state actor activity, which is of a higher level, more active than perhaps we've seen in the past. So it's quite a toxic mix. But there are ways to mitigate and manage the threats in the way that I've described. And getting that balance of the picture and the story right at board level is normally what matters and what can resonate. And the more that the true reality of cyber and what it takes to defend it against can resonate at the board level, the more they understand it, the more they're comfortable with it, the more likely that you're going to make the right organizational decisions around investment, budget, appointment of the right people, running their cybersecurity safeguards, for example, and other similar policies and governance arrangements around that. So lastly, that's my quick review around the boardroom of what cyber means and what it looks like for many companies at the moment. I'm happy to take any questions that our participants might have today.
Thank you, Rob. This was very much the presentation I was expecting to get from you, so I'm very happy to hear it. So I have here a couple of questions I would like to share with you. So how do you encourage a good security culture and safe the cyber narrative?
Yeah, I think culture is a good word there, Lassie, because it is about inculcating, developing a different culture. This culture of mindset, as I said, around, first of all, it's everyone's responsibility from the top level down. It's about resilience rather than trying to find a silver bullet solution to solve cyber. They don't exist. They never did actually, and they certainly don't now. And it's about being a bit more grown up about this. I think the cybersecurity community has gone through its childhood and now teenage years. It needs to move into an adulthood phase of being a bit more mature about seeing what this means and how we can deal with it. And I'm quite positive in that respect, that once we do that, in the way that I saw, for example, how European Union and other authorities came together to deal with the counter-terrorist threat over the last decade. That for me was quite an inspiring example of how we can mobilize a community, a public-private partnership community, to respond to a very urgent threat in society. And we did it in quite a mature way. And I think there are learning lessons to be had for cyber. But it does take a certain cultural viewpoint that has to evolve. And the thing about all companies and all organizations are that you can change the structure and change the people who are running that structure very easily, very quickly. Culture comes last of all, and culture takes a long time to develop and be embedded. And it is defined more than anything else by the same consistent messaging and by the same expression of purpose and values at a very high level by those at the board and down. So I think this has to be owned at the board level around a very clear set of purpose and values.
Thank you, Rob. So then I got a question from Mr. Mikko Myllymäki over the chat, and he's asking how important is it to know the personality and the board members and their backgrounds. This be used to turn cyber from a fear into an opportunity.
Yeah, it does very much depend on I suppose the personality and the background, the profile of the board members. Of course, if any of you are preparing to go before the board, you should absolutely do your homework and understanding who you're speaking to, of course. But in the end, they all share the same characteristics of being very professional, being very smart, having the long-term strategic interests of the company in mind, and they're all strategic thinkers. That's the point. As long as you raise your game and raise the content of your message to the strategic level, always asking the question, why would this matter to me as a board member? As long as you can answer that question, I think you'll find some success in connecting with them.
Thank you. So there's still one to come. So how do you ensure cyber risk is integrated with business risks? I believe that's the big issue. There might be the big cyber risk, but what's really the cause? How they will impact the businesses itself? How to make the board to understand it?
Well, I think, as I said in my remarks earlier, I think there are a whole range of business risks, and there have been for forever, really. And we've developed a risk management framework, quite a well-developed one in most companies. And cyber, though, does have its speciality, special color, as I said, it really needs to be managed in the same consistent way. And I think the risk management structures, therefore, need to incorporate that. I think that's one example of why and how we can move cyber out of its siloed history, really. It's had far too much of a siloed and niche background. Most companies still see it as an IT issue only, managed only by IT. That's not the case anymore, of course. We all own cybersecurity responsibility. And critically, to get it right, we need to have the very closest integration between cyber and the business, and to use cyber as much as possible to enable the business. So the challenge is as much to raise the game of cyber vertically towards the boardroom, but just as much horizontally to move it out of its silo across the business community. And indeed, of course, finally, between different companies across the industry and with public authorities as well.
Thank you, Rob. that was a very good questions, and it seems to be that there's a lot to do with the management systems, decision-making systems. So to say, question about the corporate culture, how to deal with the difficult things. So let's go ahead. So then we will have some questions to all you speakers who are still in place. And so we are asking you to comment as good as you can do it. So to all speakers, based on what you have heard from the other today, what is your key takeaways? Or is there someone wishes to react to? So if we start from the Erka, Jakub, Arne, and Rob. Is Erka online? Yes, please, Erka.
Here I am. Yes. So my first reaction go to Arne for his presentation. He kind of he was alluding to the fact that the COVID work from home situation was the new normal, and you need to accept that this is the new normal. So to kind of comment on that, internally in our workplace, we made a conscious decision to start accelerating some adoption of new technology, and we did exactly the same. We basically confiscated some server room capacity for our teams usage and etc. We made a deliberate choice to record these exceptions as, and we have a special label in our change management called COVID exceptions, so that we can revisit them and to see whether they actually become the new normal, as is the expectation, or whether we could actually fall back to something other now that the crisis seems to be behind us. That is, and we're using the same method when we need to accelerate or expedite or accept some risks when we are not quite happy with the procedure. So we want that these security decisions and risk acceptance decisions don't become part of the so-called security folklore, where in a couple of years' time somebody will revisit them with a faint memory of somebody probably haven't checked this and somebody probably having accepted it with a good conscience that this was secure enough, where in fact we were rushing and we were panicking and we were under a huge crisis. So that probably will help to institutionalize the exceptions handling and making these rushed decisions extremely visible. Would you, Arne, agree?
Yeah, I fully agree. We did the same thing in DNB. So for all the changes, we tagged them as well, and for all the risk evaluations we've done with all the changes, we revisit them many times during the COVID as well to see if are they still valid, are they still sound, etc. So don't think of it as a one-time thing, but think of it as an ongoing thing. Yes.
Rob, do you have some comments regarding this first question?
Yeah, I think COVID, at the time was a bit of a red herring. What I mean by that was that there was a lot of noise and newspaper headlines at the start of the COVID outbreak in Europe that the cyber criminals were really cashing in, and indeed we did see, a lot of attempted scams. Get your free vaccine here and so on, long before the vaccines were even developed. A lot of scams, definitely a big uptick in those. But actually, they were low-level scams, really, that unfortunately they did hit some people. But in terms of where the cyber ecosystem runs, is at the low bottom end of sophistication. And I don't think it really raised the threat level that significantly, despite the headlines at the time. The really significant takeaway for me from COVID was that it changed our vulnerability picture, not the threat, but our vulnerability, in the sense that, as Arne was talking and Erka also just said, you know, it's of course changed the way in which we do business and made us more dependent on technologies, of course. And as all companies, as we were hearing from Arne, had pivoted to a much bigger and different structure of work from home to sport work from home. And it also led in this post-COVID world to greater dependency on the cloud, on mobile working, mobile technologies, and if anything, an even greater dependency on the global supplier ecosystem. That means, of course, and we heard this in the introduction from Kristen, I think, that means that we've become, the attack surface has increased, and COVID has definitely contributed to an enhanced attack surface. And for that reason, I think there are some big legacies from COVID that we're still dealing with.
I think you're very right on that, and I see that basic cybersecurity hygiene is even more important now with the extended attack surfaces. It's like vulnerability management and all the things that is the basic hygiene services. It really needs to have a keen focus in organizations to minimize the attack surface and reduce it at least. I think that's extremely important. But I also wanted to comment on what Rob said on board focus. Observed that in the board in DNB as well and outside DNB. It's been the COVID situation has actually put cybersecurity much more on the map for the board as well. So that's at least a micro observation from Norway. I would say it's like that. Yep.
I think what we've also seen are different cybersecurity strategies, even a different paradigm emerge as a result also of this extended attack surface. So, you know, the concept of zero trust is much more prominent in the thinking now of modern cybersecurity strategies. And zero trust, which has been a concept that's been here for some time, but it's moved from just being a collection of good things, smart things to do, to something that is a different way of configuring of what cybersecurity means. And it really all stems from the fact that for many, many years, of course, most cybersecurity strategies and platforms have depended on building quite a strong external perimeter, of course, to your networks and infrastructure. What all of this means about extended attack surface, complex supply chains, and more aggressive attackers is that effectively the external perimeter, you can no longer rely on that anymore. It's no longer what it once was, and we have to change our mindset around how we have. So in comes the concept of zero trust, which is never trust, always verify, even within the boundaries of your strong perimeter, of course. And so this move towards solutions around identity and access management, especially, that can continuously re-authenticate someone's identity, has become much more prominent. And so there's a positive uptick, I think, as a response to COVID and what it meant. I think the community is becoming more mature, is learning about maybe a more fit-for-purpose way of dealing with these modern problems.
Thanks, Rob. So I do have one question to you here, and it's just like related to cyber insurance, because they are becoming very difficult to buy and expensive, as like the CISOs are becoming reluctant to buy the cyber insurance, and they want to invest money instead in a cyber security prevention instead. So it means that they're using more money to do something rather than to buy the insurances. The point here is that what is the position of the board to understand where to put the money, or how make them more aware to decide where to put the money?
Yeah, well, cyber insurance, of course, is a resource to be used potentially, and many companies have it. There are dangers, though, and concerns generally about cyber insurance, I think, because for the insurers themselves, the underwriters, I think what I detect is some general nervousness because it's very difficult to underwrite a threat, a risk that is not properly understood. You know, so the actuarial models around other types of underwriting, other types of risks, through the risk of dying in a road traffic accident or from a medical illness, are so well researched over so many decades that they can be a lot more confident about what risk they're insuring. That's not the case with cyber. So much of it is still unknown. And so it's a bit of a black hole of wondering where to go next on this as well. Another way of looking at it is, you know, from my former background of trying to understand the threat attackers, I've seen in ransomware attacks, you know, how some cyber attackers, when they first get into the system and penetrate it, and while they're still being hidden, one of the first sensitive data they look for is whether or not the company has a cyber insurance, because they know then that they may be more likely to pay out. So, you know, it's still an open issue, I think, Lassie. I don't have any strong advice to any company as to whether or not they should or shouldn't. It depends on individual circumstances, but it's not so simple, I think, as we might think.
I wish to add to
Thank you, Rob.
that.
Yes, please.
Wise board should always ask the operational staff whether the cyber insurance is the only mode of protection. So since that would be relying on faith and hope, so you can't portray cyber insurance as a standalone security control. Quite many other places need to be, quite many other security controls need to be in place as well. And in my presentation, I was also referring to the basically a cyber war incident that brought down Maersk, and cyber insurers are quite reluctant on insuring any wars or damage caused by acts of war.
Thank you, Erka. So I believe that we have to move ahead. So making a very short wrap up, I believe that we did have a very nice program today. Erka was telling more or less like what not to do, and there is a lot of skills required, not only in the operational level, but as well on the top management level. Jakub was taking up how the regulatory legislation will be changed, that it makes this more sure, and the people are more secure when they are using this type of stuff, applications or the products at home, that their threats are, or that they are secure to use them. And then Arne was more or less pointing out when something goes wrong, what needs to be done, not only making rehearsals, but really to how to leave them in the real life. That was a very good example. Thank you, Arne. And Rob was taking up very much the issues also what Jakub was referring, and that was what we were expecting to Rob to tell more about, how to find a common language between the specialists who are dealing in very deep silos with the various type of IT issues and the top management in the board level, that everybody understands that in fact they are solving the very same problems. And the guys in the top are more or less concentrating how much money to use and what should be the return on it. And maybe people in the silos are trying to protect that the water is coming not in, try to keep all the bad issues outside of your company. So this has been a very good exercise, and this won't be the last one. So for your notice that next year we are going to continue in the next FERMA forum with the same topics. Content of the stories will be the different because the world is changing so rapidly. So type file, thanks for the opening, and now I give you a chance to close this excellent seminar.
Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you especially to our great speakers for having shared their experience, their perspective on cyber risk. It was extremely informative. And a big thank to you, Lassie and Kirsten, for this excellent moderation. So you will receive the replay of this webcast as well as the slides within the next 24 hours. But before closing, I'd like to inform you that we will have the European Risk Management Awards ceremony, where the winners for all categories will be revealed on the 14th of December. So it will be an online ceremony and registration will be opening soon. So see you soon and have a nice day.